A Kansas mother who caused a deadly crash that killed 3 Girl Scouts is now shifting blame for the tragedy. In explosive jailhouse calls, Amber Peery blamed the truck driver, the justice system, and even her own car for the fatal collision. But will her claims of a rigged case and accidental crash change the outcome? I'm going to be talking with a personal injury attorney to break it all down. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. A Kansas mother who was convicted of killing 3 Girl Scouts in a car crash, including, by the way, her own daughter, is now seemingly claiming the crash wasn't her fault. 35-year-old Amber Peery was convicted back in August for this tragic October 2022 crash that claimed the lives of 3 little girls and also injured 2 others. But now she seems to be attempting to shift the blame onto a truck driver, the justice system, and maybe her own car? Yeah, so this tragedy unfolded back on October 8th, 2022, and on that day, Peery was driving her van with 5 young girls inside, and they were going to a Girl Scouts event of all things. And they were following behind 2 other cars that were also headed towards this event. So the cars were driving along Topeka's Interstate 335, which is, by the way, notorious for having dangerous stretches of roads. But that is when she and the other 2 vehicles take this wrong exit at the South Topeka interchange. And there, the southbound lanes of the Kansas Turnpike, they have no off-ramps, or they don't have any legal turnaround spots for nearly 30 miles. So, seemingly faced with no other options, the drivers make these illegal U-turns through a gap in the barrier wall. The first 2 cars, they're able to make it through safely, but Peery's unfortunately did not. Her van was struck by a semi-truck, and 3 young girls inside her car were killed. Peery's 8-year-old daughter, Brooklyn, 9-year-olds Layla El Azri and Kylie Lunn. And Peery's other child, I'll tell you, who was also in the car, survived, but apparently reportedly sustained injuries as well. And in terms of the legal consequences, before we even get into the criminal case, in April of this year, the victim's family members reached a civil settlement with Peery, the 2 other drivers, and the Girl Scouts of Northeast Kansas and Northwest Missouri. But I'll be clear, the details of that settlement, they're being confidential. We don't know exactly what it says. But while Peery agreed to the settlement, according to her attorney, she denied any negligence in connection with that crash. But then you go to the criminal case, and Peery stood trial a few months after on August 15th, which, by the way, was the 11th birthday of one of those victims, Kylie Lunn, and a jury found Peery guilty of involuntary manslaughter, aggravated battery, and 2 traffic violations. Her conviction followed a contentious trial where she rejected a plea deal that would have actually reduced some of the charges. But here's where things take a turn. Just hours after her conviction, Peery seemingly took to blaming others. How do we know that? There are a series of jailhouse phone calls that we're going to get into and we'll focus on. But first, to help me break this down, I want to bring on personal injury attorney Alea Roberts, who's now with me here on set. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Hi, Jesse. Always a pleasure.
You almost matched the curtains here.
I
We
do.
should have, almost, but it's great to see you. Really sad case. What are your initial impressions? I'm sure this happens more often than not, right?
Correct. I think my first impression is the reasonableness standard, right? I think there could have been an argument that, well, the first 2 cars, they were able to make it successfully, so I thought that I could make it successfully too. That in and of itself is a reasonable argument. But those 2 other cars might not have had 5 little girls in there, right? So the argument is you should drive a little bit safer. A reasonable person would drive safer when you have not only your children in the car, but other people's children in the car that you're responsible for. So I understand you're running late, you're trying to get there, and I understand that the difference of there being, 30-mile stretches of road where you can't make that U-turn, but there's an argument that a reasonable person would have just taken the extra minute to do that extra 30 miles and make sure that the children were safe and not drive through the barricade.
Can we break that down a little bit? So if I'm understanding correctly, right, it's kind of this, you acted recklessly. You knew there was a substantial risk of harm. You ignored it. There's a conscious disregard for it. But in this case, she's not the first person to make an illegal U-turn. Look at the 2 people in front of her. Are there legal precedents for claims involving illegal U-turns where if people do it all the time, it's illegal, it shouldn't do it, but at the same time, should she be held to that same standard? Do you think this is the correct verdict?
I think it is the correct verdict, again, because the reasonableness also attributes to the circumstances, right? Because her argument is, well, the tractor trailer should have seen me. Well, you should have seen the tractor trailer, right? If you're about to make this illegal U-turn, I know you saw the truck was coming because maybe you thought that you could make it anyway, right? That's essentially what happens. Oh, he's coming, but he'll slow down because he sees me coming, and then, I can go. But unfortunately, in this situation, the tractor trailer came into contact with the plaintiff's vehicle with those children inside, right? Because if it could have been done safely, the accident wouldn't have happened.
I totally get that, and this shouldn't have happened. But I guess at the same point, you make the wrong turn, you're left with little options. Other people have been doing this. Is it a gross deviation from a reasonable standard of care? It's kind of like the legal term for what we're talking about. When other cars have done this, I guess the question becomes: do you think this was maybe a tougher case than? Do you think would it always be prosecuted?
I think that's a great question, Jesse. I think it really just depends on the circumstances. I think whenever someone loses their lives in a motor vehicle accident, there are things to consider. I think, of course, it tugs at your heartstrings a little bit more because these are little girls who had their whole lives ahead of them, right? They were going to Girl Scouts. It's just one of those really sad cases. But we talk about gross deviations from the standard, right? Is it a gross deviation to make an illegal U-turn in and of itself? No. Should you have taken better care and taken a little bit of extra, maybe if you just took an extra 10 or 15 seconds just to wait for that truck to go by, and then you could have merged, right? Yeah. Because unfortunately, we've all seen it happen, right? You're sitting in traffic, you can't turn around, and then I'm just gonna go through the barricade, right? You see it even on the highways in New Jersey going into New York City. There's barricades in between, you just pop in and make a U-turn. But the key there is to wait for traffic that it's safe. Wait sure you have at least a car length. Maybe if it's a highway and people are traveling, maybe 2 car lengths in between yourself and the car that's coming up to make sure that you get into the lane safely. Because
she could have pulled over to the shoulder of the road and waited for the traffic to clear, but instead just went from the right lane.
Correct.
That's the issue.
Correct.
And there is this back and forth about it, if she thought that this semi-truck was following her and whether she could make the turn. Mistakes like that are not enough of a defense, right?
No.
Why is that?
They're not. I think because it's not reasonable. And you also look at where the impact on her car was. I didn't see the impact on the tractor trailer, but the impact on her car was from, I believe it was the passenger side right, where a lot of the damage was. So that means that you were trying to merge and there wasn't enough time. That's why the damage is all on that side of your vehicle.
I want to talk about the civil settlement. Really sensitive case. You're talking about the death of young people, wrongful death case. Generally, what is it like negotiating these kinds of cases? Do they always, every case is different, but is the goal to try to get into a settlement because, there's always the risk of trial, but talk to me about what we should be thinking about when you're dealing with wrongful death cases in traffic collisions like this.
Sure, so especially because they were children, that matters a lot because then you have to look at, which sounds very silly, looking at a child's grades, right? But that's something they consider. How were the kids doing in school? Would they have gone to college? If they went to college,
you mean the harm, like the damages?
The damages, right? Because we're looking at their lives are now lost, right? And of course, one can argue, well, as 11 years old, well, what were you doing? Well, those kids might have been in sports. They might have been, doing really well in school. Maybe there's an argument to be made that they would have went to college because their parents went to college, or they were on track for all of these different things. So then you look at that when you're considering a settlement, because then it's like, well, if this person would have become an adult and went to college, they would have arguably made enough money to take care of themselves and possibly take care of their parents, right? So we're looking at the entire spectrum of their lives, not just the 11 years that they were there. And then you start doing numbers, you get what's called a damages expert, but specifically in life expectancy and value. They come in and they're also known as an economics expert that will come in and say, okay, here's how old your child was. Here's based off of, where their grades are, based off of the activities they were doing. Here's an argument that they could have done X, Y, and Z. It could be as simple as one of the kids was really good at playing soccer, right? Yeah. They would have gotten a soccer scholarship went on to school. You know, the arguments, as long as there's enough evidence there, those are the arguments to be made. So when I look at a damages settlement, I'm looking at each of these, a civil suit, excuse me, I'm looking at each of these children. What is the value of how much their lives are? Would they have had to take care of their parents? Because that's also another aspect of things. As your parents get older, we take care of them, right? Now the parents don't have their children to take care of them. That's another avenue that we're looking at when we try to get a round number. Because at the end of the day, you can never say, well, your life is worth 1 million and your life is worth 3 million. You have to have some sort of substantive evidence as to what the value of life is.
Can you explain to our audience why the settlement is confidential, especially when you're dealing with public entities like the Girl Scouts?
Well, because then it's twofold, right? One thing is, if this happens later in life, God forbid, we want to make sure that there's not, well, I can rely on the precedent in this case for the settlement for this much. So because there were 3 girls on their way to Girl Scouts in Kansas, if there are 3 girls on the way to Girl Scouts in Florida, and God forbid this happens again, I can go and say, hey, but look what they did in Kansas. Look how much they settled for here. And these are very, very similar facts. So you don't have that to rely on. So every case is different. And then you are forced to, you know, start from ground zero.
Talking about agreements, moving on from the civil case, the settlement now to the criminal case. I have to ask you about this. So I want to talk about this plea deal, or this reported plea deal that Peery turned down. So prosecutors had apparently offered to drop the 3rd count of involuntary manslaughter if she had pled guilty to counts 1 and 2. She chose not to take the offer, and apparently she actually expressed regret later on for not doing that. What do you make of that decision?
I make of that decision that she understands that she's going to go to jail. I think that I mean, we haven't seen sentencing yet, but 2 little girls have lost their lives. She called it a, like you said earlier, she blamed everybody else, right? The whole point of this conviction is you're supposed to show remorse, right? And not just a Facebook post, because I know people cite to that, well, she posted on Facebook that she was so sad that her daughter was gone. Okay, but you're not showing remorse, because then you have to take accountability. I was wrong in that I should have waited for the cars to go by. But instead, it's the truck should have seen me. Instead, it's the other parents, you know, they're pushing for this lawsuit. They're trying to make an example out of me. Well, ma'am, right? Let's take some responsibility for.
Well, she probably thought she could win the case.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. Yeah. And that's unfortunate, because it's you're playing a gamble, right? You're playing a gamble with your life, because now, unfortunately, children's lives are lost. So you can't then just say, well, I'm taking I think she called it God wants to sit me down was one of her jail cell calls. Yeah.
Let's get into these. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the audio of them, but I will explain what they are. So there are these series of calls that she apparently makes from jail. This is following her conviction. And again, Peery appears to deflect blame like everywhere, because right after her conviction, she expressed frustration with the judicial system. And she made really shocking claims saying, it's so rigged. I feel like the blank jurors were paid off for something. In another call from September, Peery blamed the truck driver, 70-year-old Robert Russell, saying, should have seen my blank blinker and braked. I literally don't know what blank hit me. I thought a bomb went off. And then in another call, she said that her van was at fault because of the condition that it was in. And by the way, she didn't quite quit the blame game at that, because as according to local reporting, Peery also accused the parents of the 2 other girls of committing perjury. Leah, first of all, I cover too many cases like this where, don't you know, those calls are being recorded? So your take on what we're hearing there, and bigger question, how could it affect her sentencing?
I think that it's going to have a huge effect on her sentencing, because again, normally when people are responsible for the loss of life, it is, I can't believe this happened. I'm so sorry. I can't believe that this occurred. They don't start playing, it's everybody's fault except mine. So if you're not standing up and taking accountability and showing remorse for the situation, not saying that like it's 100% my fault, but at least say I was driving the car and I was involved in a motor vehicle accident and children's lives were lost, right? Unfortunately, we don't really hear that, right? Because it's everybody else's fault on the jail cell calls. So then once we get into sentencing, of course the prosecution's going to play those calls, because that's part of what the actual sentence is going to be. Judge, listen, not only is the defendant not taking accountability, Ms. Peery, not taking accountability for what happened, she's also not remorseful. She's not regretful.
And by the way, she also had complained that the investigation was unfairly focused on her, saying, everything just went toward me. It's just not fair. It's just not. You know, she just finished a case. She raised arguments that she wasn't responsible, whether it was, you know, the car was faulty, whether it was the driver's fault, shoddy investigation, if these are all arguments her defense team could make, like any other criminal case, if you're just saying, look, I was convicted, I think it was wrong, I'm still standing by the arguments I made, probably going to appeal it. Why is that so wrong for her to say these things? I mean, I guess saying the parents committed perjury is really bad. But the other parts, if these are legal arguments that were made, why is that so bad?
I don't think it's bad. I think everyone has to have a defense. I just think that there is a fine line, and some of it has to do with optics as well, right? Especially if you're talking about a jury of her peers. Because reasonable people in this situation would have a little bit of, oh my goodness, I can't believe that happened, right? We're not hearing that. We're not hearing like, oh my goodness, I can't believe, unfortunately, these girls' lives are lost. It's the girls' parents committed perjury. Well, even if that's the case, their children are gone. And they, as the parents of these children, entrusted you to get those children to the Girl Scouts event safely, right? Take some accountability for that. I think that's what the issue is. And of course, when sentencing comes, because we have a very wide range, I think it's like 31 months minimum and 136 months maximum, which is about 2.5 years to about 13 years. That's a very wide range. But if I go before a judge and I'm pointing the finger and I'm blaming everyone else, and then coupled with these jail cell calls, I'm just reciting the same defenses that I made before and not, I'm sorry, judge. I'm not saying I'm guilty, but I'm sorry that this happened. That's going to come into play.
And she also kind of hung to this idea. She said in one of the calls, I didn't kill 3 children. I got in a car accident. But to be clear, maybe it's a little bit of semantics, but legally, this could still be an accident, but it's not like they're saying she intended to kill the children. Something could be an accident. This was not what she wanted. This was not intentional. But if there was negligence, if there was recklessness, you're still at fault. It might be unintentional, it might be a tragedy, but you could still legally be held responsible. So I don't think she likes the idea of I killed 3 children, but it's the idea of you're still legally responsible for their deaths.
Right, and that's where we get into the difference between negligence versus an intentional tort, right? Because I intended to commit this crime or I intended to do something versus my negligence, the fact that I didn't do something the way a reasonable person would have done it, and my recklessness in the situation, because we know that motor vehicle accidents happen often. We know that the cars are dangerous, the road is dangerous. You're driving in 1 second, the next second you're in an accident, right? That happens all the time. So then you take that into accountability as well, and then we highlight the fact that 3 little girls no longer have their lives.
Yeah, and then there's another call, by the way, I haven't even mentioned, where she appears to make light of this situation when she expressed her belief that she would avoid prison time, saying, this is a vacation at a 2-star hotel and it's almost done. Kansas likes to keep families together. This is a case where I shouldn't be taken from my kids. So Alea, if I understand it correctly, her defense has been pushing for no prison, rehabilitation, right? But you mentioned that when you look at all these charges, and I know sentencing can have a number of factors, but if they're the maximum, they're run consecutively, one after the other, not concurrently, she could be looking at double digits in prison. What do you think is a more reasonable assessment of what her punishment will be?
I think whenever you have a situation like this, right, if it's her first offense, if she doesn't have a criminal background or a criminal history, I think that it's fair to argue that, you're taking me away from my children, and that's a fair.
And they also say mental health issues and raising the children.
Right,
yeah.
But there are mental health facilities and treatments in prison, right? We do pay for them, so it's not like you can't go to therapy while you're in jail. I think the argument that, I'm mentally incapacitated, so therefore I can't go to jail is laughable, because the criminal justice system sends people with mental health issues to jail all the time. That's why we have these assistants, like we have therapists, we have group therapy, we have psychiatrists in prisons to help deal with those issues. But to say I shouldn't go to jail because I lost the lives of my children, the counter argument to that is, well, but you realize that some of that, if we're not saying all of it's on you or your fault, but some of that you have to take responsibility for. And you're not doing that.
And it seems like the victims' families are really pushing for a prison sentence here. And as for the victims in this case, so Kylie Lunn's mother, Tiffany Lunn, she took to Facebook to share these heartbreaking news of the loss of her daughter, saying that she was best friends with the other victim in this case, Layla El Azri. And her Facebook post read in part, she was my everything and I was her everything, and my heart is just broken right now. I just don't know where to go from here. She was my purpose. She was my everything. I'm just lost without her. There's a GoFundMe page that was set up for Layla by loved ones to help her family cover the funeral costs. And the page reads in part, Layla's precious soul was taken from us too soon. What was going to be a fun day turned to tragedy. And as we were talking about before, Peery also took to Facebook to share the heartbreaking news of the death of her own daughter, Brooklyn, saying, I honestly don't know how I'm going to keep going without you, but I know I have to, and everything I do will be a purpose for you. And when you think about those statements, I wonder if the judge will look at that and say, you know, the idea of her losing her own daughter, a very traumatic event, but also taking into account what the families want, that's a tough balancing test. It's kind of a gray area here about what the sentence should be.
For sure, for sure. I don't think that she should receive the maximum sentence and run concurrently. I don't believe that, right? Especially if, you know, like we said before, she's also a grieving mother. She also lost her child, right? I think that there is, you know, grief looks different for some people. Some people laugh their way through it, right? And maybe that's what she's doing. That could be an argument that could be made. Like, I've lost my mind to the point where I'm just going to laugh it off and, you know, act like I'm not as upset as I really am. But then on the other side of things, it's like there has to be justice, right? Yeah. One thing we talk about in law school all the time is justice looks different for all the parties involved. Justice for Ms. Peery might be, I'm not going to jail, I'm going to a mental health facility. But justice for the parents is, this woman is the reason that my children are not here. So the fact that she gets to walk away scot-free is unacceptable, right? And I'm sure they're also leaning on the prosecution as well, saying you got to get us something. You can't just let her, you know, get away scot-free.
Well, as for Ms. Peery, she remains behind bars until the continuation of her sentencing, which is scheduled for December 3rd, and that is where Shawnee County District Judge Jessica Heinen will decide her fate. We talked about what the potential of that could be. Listen, Alea Roberts, thanks so much for coming on. It was great seeing you, and thanks for coming here on Sidebar.
Thank you, Jesse. Always a pleasure.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us, and as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.